Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Washington Gun Law TV. I am Washington Gun Law President William Kirk. Thanks for joining us. Hey, as a follow-up to this video right here, I got a lot of response from a lot of you viewers down in the great state of Oregon, and I want to thank you for that. And I learned a lot more about this ballot measure that had been the subject of that video, which I said was not the worst piece of gun legislation that I'd ever read in my life, but it was on a very short list of one of the worst pieces of legislation. Well, come to find out, I think a lot of you folks down in Oregon are being misled by this ballot measure, and I think we need to do something that we like to do frequently here at Washington Gun Law, which is kind of just give it to you straight so that you can actually make intelligent decisions. So, today we're going to circle back on this and spend a few minutes to talk about how Oregon voters are being misled by Ballot Measure 114. Okay, so the issue we're talking about is Oregon Ballot Measure 114. Why is a Washington gun law attorney talking about an Oregon ballot measure? Well, I think all of us around the country need to be very cognizant of what happens out here on the left coast. For those of you who live in the middle of this country or down in the south where you still get to enjoy life more similar to what Americans should enjoy, if you want to know what type of gun control legislation, what type of gun control agenda is likely to come your way someday, well, pay attention to the nut jobs out here on the West Coast, because we are the ones that invent the craziness when it comes to legislation. Now, California absolutely leads the charge. They are the king of crazies, and there's not even a close second. Now, our governor here spends his entire professional career trying to emulate the governor in California. And then, of course, there is the great state of Oregon, which is a wonderful state, a beautiful state, but unfortunately run by some nut jobs right now. Now, along comes Ballot Measure 114. Now, Ballot Measure 114 is being sold to the Oregon voters as, it's just a magazine ban. That's literally how they're trying to sell this to you. Is like, we're just getting rid of those high capacity magazines because, that's why we got all the crime here in Oregon. That's why we got all the people getting killed here in Oregon. And if we just get rid of the high capacity magazines, then we're fine. Now, unlike what Washington just did this past legislative session, where we essentially restricted the commercial sale of high capacity magazines, and grandfathered a lot of them in, Oregon's legislation on Ballot Measure 114 would actually prohibit the possession of these magazines as well. Now, it too has a grandfathering clause, but I cannot reconcile how it's unlawful to possess and yet you can grandfather them in. But you see, Oregon, this ballot measure does much, much more than just limit magazine capacity. And in fact, I encourage everybody to very carefully read this terrible piece of legislation, because what else does it do? Well, it creates a state gun registry. How does it create a state gun registry? Well, you see, under this new legislation, it would require everyone in Oregon to get a license before they can even go to attempt to purchase a firearm. Let me say that again. You would actually have to go get a license to then be able to go exercise one of your constitutional rights. So essentially, you have the government's going to decide whether or not they're going to grant you the privilege of having a license so that you can then go exercise a constitutional right. Now, just think if the state of Oregon had a proficiency exam to vote or some kind of political litmus test before you could exercise your right to free speech, or some kind of religious litmus test before you could get the license so that you could go practice the religion of your choice. Apparently, those things would all be outrageous, but this is exactly what the state of Oregon is proposing. Now, a lot of you say, okay, so what's the big deal? I got to pay a few bucks and get a license, right? Well, no, there is much, much more to it. You see, because in order to get this license, if this ballot measure becomes law, you're going to have to take a proficiency exam, classes. These are not just sit in a classroom type classes. These are actual live fire classes in which you will have to demonstrate the proficiency of the firearm. Now, there is nobody here in the lawful and responsible gun owning community that is opposed to training, and we all recommend and always encourage the most training humanly possible. But to mandate that before you exercise a constitutional right, that is where the big problem lies. There's much more to it, because this training can only be done under the supervision of law enforcement at certain ranges, many of which do not even exist in the state of Oregon. And even though the state of Oregon has come up with all of these ideas through this legislation of what they want to do, they have not come up with a single penny of how to fund any of this. Now, of course, the creation of that license in order to be able to go exercise a right is data that the state now is able to keep and access at any time they want for any reason, which means you now have paid for the privilege of having a state gun registry. Listen, I found this little article on OregonLive.com, and of course, this was talking about how the polls show that this ballot measure is going to pass with flying colors. Now, we all know how scientifically accurate polls have been in the last several political cycles, but there is some alarming data in here that I wanted to talk to the folks in Oregon about, and I wanted to make the rest of you aware in the rest of the country, because this is the type of legislation that you may be combating in the near future as well. Okay, one of the pieces of data is that 57% of women support this ballot measure, and only 43% of men support this ballot measure. So there is a large majority of women that support this ballot measure. Now, ladies, this is what I want you to be able to understand, is that if we are in a situation in which a woman is now subject to some type of a violent, abusive relationship, and she cannot get law enforcement or anybody else to assist her, her ability to go out and arm herself and be able to protect her and her children and her family and her property is virtually impossible for this type of situation. You see, she would have to first be able to go get a license so that she could then go get the gun. Of course, to be able to get the license, she needs to have a gun in order to go to the class so that she can shoot and demonstrate her proficiency, but she can't get a gun because she doesn't have a license. And you see the circular trap that the state of Oregon is setting here. Meanwhile, while this poor woman is fearing for her life, she's not able to protect herself. And we all know how that story all too commonly ends, and it does not end well. So in many ways, the demographic group in this country that is in most need of security and the ability to defend themselves is the female community. And so what I'm asking all of the women in Oregon to do is to reconsider your position on this ballot measure. This will not make your community safer, and it certainly is not going to make you safer. Now, the strongest support for this ballot measure, of course, comes from Multnomah and Washington counties, better known as the general Portland area, with overwhelming support coming out of there. Now, we can understand the political reasons for that. And without getting too political here, let me just ask the people in Portland, Oregon, this question. Is your city better off today than it was 10 years ago? And we know the answer to that question. And then I want to ask you, how much of the problem that you have in your city is created by guns? Because I think that you, like Seattle and like San Francisco, basically your city has a heroin problem that is disguising itself as a homeless problem. And you have a city council problem that disguises itself as leadership. And while I certainly understand the utopian type world that you strive for, reality at some point needs to set in, and you have to ask yourself, how many more times do we need to double down on the current policies before we realize that perhaps Portland, Oregon is only getting worse under the current scheme? And for all those people in Portland, Oregon who do remember when it used to be one of the absolute premier cities anywhere in the United States, very similar to Seattle, let us not forget that while the state is trying to disarm you, local government is defunding your police department. How many of you in Multnomah County are sick and tired of paying higher taxes, and yet at the same time the quality of life surrounding you on a daily basis deteriorates at a rapid level? And finally, and this is perhaps most alarming, 63% of college educated, those with a college degree, support ballot measure 114, while only 40% of those without a college diploma support it. Now, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us it's a pretty good argument for why we maybe shouldn't be investing hundreds of thousands of dollars in college degrees anymore. Listen, this ballot measure is basically being spearheaded by two organizations that are funding almost this whole thing, Safe Communities Oregon and Lift Every Voice Oregon. Listen, the bottom line is this. Folks in Oregon, you are being misled. If you think that ballot measure 114 is just about a magazine capacity, you're kidding yourself. It is about much, much more, and it is happening at a time when state government is continuing to try to disarm its citizens, while local government is working overtime to make your communities less and less safe. Do yourself, do your neighbors, and do everybody in Oregon a favor and vote against ballot measure 114. Listen, if you have any questions about this or anything else related to your Second Amendment rights, remember you can always contact us at WashingtonGunLaw.com, or of course you can call us directly at 425-765-0487. Now, let's remember, part of being the lawful and responsible gun owner, like we talk about all the time here at Washington Gun Law, is to know what the law is in every situation, how it applies to you in any instance that you may find yourself. Until next time, thanks for watching. Stay safe.